And tonight we're going to be discussing a huge topic on the future of our profession. The first thing I'm going to say is stop press, because you probably saw maybe last Thursday the RIBA announced publication of Towards Tomorrow's Architecture, and its headline proposal is the repeal of the Architects Act. So that would effectively mean abolishing the ARB. So pretty big issue. And the RIBA argues that ending the Act would support its push for improved professional competence and allow a new system of reserved activities overseen by a proposed Built Environment Council. So some really interesting ideas coming out of this, where she quotes Vitruvius, I think with a little bit of license, but she quotes him as saying, "Would to God that protection of function for architectural services were also the law of the Roman people, for the ignorant would no longer run riot with impunity." Chris Dyson is going to go first. Chris's practice, Chris Dyson Architects, has been producing some amazing buildings and retrofit projects for over 20 years now, and he's going to be speaking from the standpoint of his experience and setting out a position where he feels we should be heading from here. Eleanor Jolliffe's been writing about the practice of architecture for a number of years, for journals like BD and in her book. Finally, Chris Williamson, current president of the RIBA and past master of the Architects Company, and I suspect probably a good reason why we have quite a full room tonight. Everyone wants to hear what he's got to say about this.
Good evening. I came into architecture thanks to encouragement from my art master at school. Very few kids from my background went into this field, so I had to investigate it for myself. I studied at Oxford Polytechnic and then Glasgow School of Art. And prior to establishing my own studio, I had travelled far and wide with quite well-known architects. However, I want to speak today not about the vantage point of global practice, nor of the safety of academia, but from a small architectural design-focused studio. Some 75% of RIBA members fall into this bracket. We work mostly with existing buildings, ordinary streets, tight sites, tighter budgets, and very real constraints. But we also currently have 2 Level 7 apprenticeships, discovering in real time what this profession involves. And they have been with our studio for many years. From this perspective, you don't get a grand overview of the future, but you do get a very clear view of how education and practice align, or quietly miss each other. I see the arguments around protecting the function of the architect and supporting apprenticeships as inseparable. Few employers will invest in apprenticeships if the outcome of long-term training is no longer commercially useful. The profession is changing. Procurement models, regulation, climate responsibility, digital coordination, and public scrutiny now shape architecture as much as design culture ever did. The era of the architect as solitary author, sketching heroically while others handle consequences, is largely a myth. So the question is not how we defend architecture from change, but how we prepare architects to work productively, responsibly, and imaginatively within it. In a small practice, the future doesn't arrive gradually, it arrives on Monday morning. There are no buffers, no specialist departments. Every drawing, every decision carries weight. Architecture is increasingly about judgment. Many graduates arrive in our office visually fluent, conceptually agile, and wonderfully articulate, but often they're underprepared for responsibility. The fact that a line on a drawing is also a liability, a cost, a delay, or a compliance issue. Responsibility must be taught not as a constraint on creativity, but in a serious and useful form. If we speak about protecting the title, we must also speak about protecting the function. The public interest is not served simply by reserving the word architect. It is served by ensuring the architect remains responsible for safety, technical competence, statutory compliance, heritage, environmental performance, and long-term stewardship. That function is formed in practice. Apprenticeships are not an alternative to professional standards, they reinforce them. They embed learning in the realities of procurement, regulation, contract, administration, and construction. Apprentices learn how to draw, how drawings translate into risk, cost, liability, and public consequence. If we weaken apprenticeships, we risk producing architects who understand architecture only in theory. If we strengthen them, we strengthen the function of an architect, in my view. Apprenticeships are also a broad access that matters enormously. They reveal unseen work of mentorship, effort that in a small practice is not a line in a strategy document, but a Tuesday afternoon task. If apprenticeships are to shape the future, they need collective support, not quiet reliance on goodwill and caffeine. We also need an honest conversation about the length and structure of architectural training. Long education can be valuable if coherent, purposeful, and aligned with professional reality, but duration alone is not virtue. Exhaustion should not be mistaken for seriousness. The future profession requires clarity about what architects are being trained for and how that training enables contribution rather than postponing it. The nature of architectural work is shifting. The future will be shaped less by buildings on empty sites and more by adaptation, reuse, repair, and care. In cities like London, this is not a niche, it's a mainstream. Working with what exists requires humility, technical knowledge, patience, and occasionally negotiating with a 200-year-old wall that disagrees with your section. These skills are learned through exposure to constraints and reinforced by the climate emergency. Sustainability in practice is rarely about drama. It is about material choices, durability, restraint, and often choosing not to build more than necessary. Digital tools will continue to evolve, but the future architect will not be defined by software proficiency alone. Technology should expand architectural capacity, not reduce the architect to a compliance manager. Enduring skills remain judgment, clarity of thought, the ability to synthesize complexity, and confidence to take responsibility. And yes, a good hand-drawn sketch is still worth 100 renderings. Architecture now operates in a contested civic territory: housing, heritage, inequality, climate. We cannot retreat into an internal discourse. We must engage with our public honestly through exhibitions, outreach, and conversation about the value we provide. Regulation, post-Grenfell frameworks, and ethics shape the profession, but they must reinforce responsibility within a design culture, not exist as a separate layer. The future of the profession will be plural, I think. Some architects will design buildings, others will shape policy, research, technology, development, or education. Diversity is not a threat to our identity. It's an evidence of strength. What matters is that education equips people with transferable judgment, spatial intelligence, and ethical awareness, skills that extend well beyond a single building type. There are still things worth protecting. The title architect signals public responsibility. Design intelligence helps society use space, resources, and history wisely. Small practices matter, places where care, continuity, and mentorship are tangible. In my view, the future will not be secured through defensiveness or exclusion. It will be secured through openness, relevance, and purpose, and through an education system confident enough to change alongside the world it serves, even when that world, like many clients, redesigns the brief halfway through. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. So I thought I would ask the question, who should be allowed to design buildings? Which I think is very much on the sort of forefront of everyone's minds this evening. Probably about half the room is thinking that the restriction of function is a good idea, that it promotes public safety. You might be on board with the RIBA's recent position. Some of you might think this is economic protectionism and should be avoided. That the public should have a choice, that anyone should be allowed to design their building. But is that the case? Do they have that choice? Should they? Should design be restricted? It feels inherently uncomfortable to suggest that it should. It feels like architecture is an art, and we shouldn't restrict this art form because it denies natural genius. We could, very appropriately here this evening, point to Christopher Wren outside, who was an astronomer and physicist. We could point to Leonardo da Vinci, who was trained in painting and sculpture. And more recently, perhaps we could point to Tadao Ando, who is a professional boxer, I recently discovered. Or indeed, perhaps more controversially, Thomas Heatherwick, who trained in 3D design and furniture. However, to just point to those people would be to ignore the vast teams of professional people and professionally trained and qualified people who helped them to realize their visions. These were not lone wolves who did everything by themselves. It's very much a myth. And of course, it would be to misunderstand design, because design is not simply about aesthetics. Architecture is not just about a beautiful shape. It's about coordinating the mundane reality of the plumbing, the ventilation, the structure, the wheelchair turning circle, the quiet room, whatever it might be. And then, of course, assuming you get past the various regulatory hurdles, it's to further battle on site with construction supply chains, disinterested subcontractors, bad weather, and huge groups of financially and emotionally engaged stakeholders, all of who've got very large opinions about exactly what happens. Architectural and engineering practice, because it's as much about engineers as it is about architects, is as much about the process as the concept sketch being pulled from the pen of the genius, or the mouse of the genius. And I think it's that practice that should be protected, not the art of envisioning 3D space. Of course, as we all know, in the UK, anyone can act as an architect and fulfill all of the functions. The title is limited, and I'm sure all of us struggle through our CPD records, or most of us struggle through our CPD records, and tick the boxes every year and pay the money to be called an architect, and then anyone else can actually do the job. It's slightly Kafkaesque, really, if you think about it. And it does make me wonder why we created such an absurdly stupid system. Of course, the truth is we never meant to. Right from the 1790s, when you had the first discussions about closing the profession, people have looked at the best way to maintain standards in architecture and building safety. It took until 1938, so getting on for 150 years, for the title to be protected. And then, of course, in 1939, everyone got a little bit distracted by World War II, and we never returned to the topic again. We've been left with a halfway house that doesn't really serve anybody very well. If you come through to the Grenfell Inquiry stated that there's no consistent definition or enforcement of competence or standards for public accountability, which is there's generally insufficient recognition and benefit for those who do the right thing, and very limited consequences for those who do not. So do we believe this is right? That freedom of expression should be protected above all concerns about safety and competent practice? And I think that takes the argument of natural genius a bit too far. For even the lone wolves we talked about earlier will care enough about their vision that it's executed well and safely. And that freedom, complete freedom, just leaves things open to the cowboys that we all struggle against. Speaking as an architect, dealing with all of the regulatory loopholes and CPD records and all the rest, I don't really care who uses the term. If policy mandarins want to be architects, fine. If software designers want to be architects, fine. I think we've got bigger problems. I think we've got bigger problems that the 23,000 homes and the Great British Insulation Scheme need refitting because somebody didn't do the calculations properly. I think it matters because an airspace development in West London caused extensive flooding and structural issues to the flats below. And I think it matters because a modular construction company dissolved itself with no consequences after building 3 schools in the UK with major structural issues. And it only took me 5 minutes to find on Google to find 3 examples in the last 2 years that were sufficiently dramatic to make national headlines. So how many thousands of these instances are going unreported and unnoticed? I don't think it's protectionism that we regulate the process of architecture and that it's carried out by regulated professionals. In the same way, I don't think it's protectionism that brain surgery, pharmaceutical dispensing, and probate are all carried out by regulated professionals. It's a matter of safety. Let anyone draw the sketch or guide the aesthetic, but to suggest that the full design of a building should be undertaken without regulatory oversight is to take belief in natural genius and human goodness just a little bit too far.
I'm not a protectionist by any means. I don't think architects have a God-given right to design buildings. What I do believe, and the reason I tried to raise the profile of the debate, was I think it's the right time to do it, as the government are already looking at the regulation of functions within a lot of the professions post-Grenfell, but also to highlight the absurd situation where you have to register with RIBA to call yourself an architect. And it was actually when I was handing out 300 certificates to Part 3 students, the best and the brightest of the profession, and having to explain to their parents afterwards at this fantastic graduation ceremony that there was so much pride from their parents that their kids had become an architect, and then having to explain to them that actually anybody can do what an architect does. They couldn't get their heads around that they had to pay 225 quid to ARB to call yourself an architect, but then it didn't actually mean anything. So it has raised the debate, and what we now need to do is to get to the next level and actually collaborate with the rest of the building industry to regulate the functions of what an architect can do. So that's what I'm working on at the moment, and part of the reason we wanted to do this event tonight was to get other people's opinions. But when I stood as president, the reason I wanted to do it is the RIBA has been fantastic throughout my career in, first of all, starting as an architect, but taking me to the next level, not just in competitions and giving me the opportunity to win projects, both at home and abroad. But it's actually been an inspiration, and I think that's what it needs to do now, and bring the rest of the professionals together and actually work out a matrix of functions based on the RIBA plan of work, and look at who is the competent professional who can do those roles. So at the start, it might be an architect and brief writers or planners or community engagement professionals. And at the end, it might be an architect and building analysts looking at cost in use or life cycle costings, or a clerk of works to sign off the process. But I think we would obviously like to get an architect in as many boxes as possible, but we're recognising that there are other competent professionals that might be able to do some, if not all, of those roles as well. And it's a matter of raising the standards of every part of the building process and making sure that the right person. And so when I stood, I was going to stand on a single platform of education, because I think our education system in architecture schools isn't fit for purpose anymore. We need to have a grounding of what an architect does, and we need to have know who the specialists are that we need to call on for things that we don't know what to do. And so buildings are becoming so complex. So that we're producing architects that need to do everything. If you're a one-man band in Saffron Walden, but we also need to allow people to curate their own careers. And we've got this absurd situation where I did 120 hours of lifelong learning a year ago to become a BREEAM assessor on infrastructure projects. 120 hours, and I was only allowed to write down 2 hours in my logbook, in my CPD, because there's all these other things I need to do. We should allow people to curate their own careers in their lifetime. We shouldn't ask Simon to do the same CPD as a 30-year-old project architect. It's just an absurd situation, and so and then we can assess if the right person is doing the right role in their office. So I think this opportunity to assess that the way the system works, to assess our education, to assess our lifelong learning and actually do something about it. The timing was right to do this. What it has done has stimulated a debate. We've now got to take it to that next step and make sure that government aren't going to listen to what architects want, especially if we seem to be wanting to protect functions. We've got to regulate the functions, make sure the competent person is doing the right job throughout the whole of the design and completion and assessment of the building, and not just look backwards at Grenfell and how we could have avoided that, but look forward at what AI is going to allow other people to do, and what other skills we need to learn in order to still call ourselves architects. And there's all sorts of, I mean, I referenced this earlier, Robin's Edge debate recently. There's a fantastic woman who runs Foster's facade engineering department, and she's setting up, or seems to want to set up, a facade engineering professional body, and that should be part of the RIBA. We should embrace a lot more specialists within us, and that might include community engagement and stakeholder managers, business managers, specialist conservationists, heritage, AI, and embrace all of those specialist skills within architecture, and make sure the right people are doing the right role in the right projects, and assessing them. So I'd like to see the RIBA become more of a qualification, as a badge of excellence, and you should be able to put a certificate on your wall like a doctor does to prove to your client, your employer, that you've got these specialist skills. This is what I've concentrated on this year, and this is why I can go to another employer or another client, and it's a demonstration of my value, and actually means something that you've tackled certain issues, and then you're curating your own career. It doesn't mean to say you have to do it for the rest of your life, but it becomes a way of increasing the value, either as an architect to your client or as an architect, a young architect, to your employer. So I'll be interested in everybody else's comment. That's the reason I took the action that I did, and I was quite surprised in a way, because I thought in the usual course of things the RIBA would say, don't rock the boat, don't do that. I was actually quite encouraged that they were so enthusiastic, and before I could have any second thoughts, they'd done a press release, and I couldn't have changed my mind even if I'd wanted to. But it's actually got us to the point where we can actually, we've already had more meetings with the government and with other professional institutes than we'd had previously. So it has actually brought things to a head, and now we need to make sure we're progressing in the right way to get the right people in the right roles throughout the course of the building projects. Thank you.
Paul Karakusevich, architect. Just picking up on our President's last point, I wonder if there's something in the law profession who are probably charging 8 to 10 times our hourly rates at the moment, you wouldn't have a corporate lawyer suddenly advising on your divorce or your probate or your tax situation. And I wonder, just picking up on Chris's sort of final point about specialisation, whether there is actually something in that, and the architect cannot be master of all things for too much longer in the future, given our average daily rate in the room is probably about £600, which barely pays pays the salary, the rent, the insurance, and everything else that a practice is meant to earn. Meanwhile, a lawyer will be doing 10 times that, probably as a minimum. So I do think that specialisation, and then maybe we can't all just turn our hand to a cathedral, a station, a transport network, or a bit of housing, or an opera house, all within a week. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Paul. So on to Chris, do you want to pick up on that? It goes probably to some extent to the root of what was being discussed at your meeting this afternoon.
Yeah, so having specialist skills, I think, works for lawyers, works for doctors, and they're the people we want to. Most of my mailbag is they're the professions that we look to when we're comparing salaries. We're actually acting like actors and musicians, and we want to dabble rather than specialise. And I completely agree. I think when you qualify as a doctor, you then specialise, and that gives you greater earning capacity. And it's not just about the money; it's about making sure. I mean, the building industry you need specialist skills, and it shouldn't prevent you from switching from one type of project to another. If you collaborate, if you're still a designer, but you need the specialist skills to do certain projects, because a lot of projects these days are complicated. So in the matrix that I was describing about the roles of an architect fitting the right, it would be not completely different, but slightly different for smaller projects and house extensions, but it might be more complicated if it was in a conservation area or there were particular listed building or heritage issues. But I think it shouldn't be beyond our wit to be able to convince the government that these roles need to be done by specialists, and we have specialist knowledge, and we can assess that. And it actually gives ARB more to do. Somebody has to regulate the functions rather than just police the title.
Christopher Wren running that site, but that site had huge complexities and lots of different skill sets working within it. And I think clients still want that responsibility of a one-stop shop with the person who's leading the team. I think we mustn't, in this discussion about specialisms, lose sight of that fact that you are, as the architect, you are the name who's leading that team.
Hi, I'm writing a piece of work. It's taken me nearly 10 years at the moment. I understand this issue about specialism, protection of function, economic returns, etc., etc., etc. The principal problem that we're dealing with is activity in sequence with specialism. Now, the practice and the literature and the history of architecture teaches us, and also engineering, that you need knowledge for that, that's consistently applied. Consistent applied knowledge is how specialism is integrated in building. It's quite unique in buildings. It's not like medicine, it's not like law, it's actually unique. And I think we must celebrate that. And I'd like to ask the three contributors how they would go about establishing valued knowledge in the profession and ensuring or trying to support people understanding how that is so important, as if not specialism generates returns to individual groups, which is precisely why a person over here would identify specialism correctly, and I don't disagree, but that doesn't necessarily add value to society in buildings.
The danger of this, of course, is we just build up a load of exams. And the last thing that many of us are good at, well, I certainly wasn't very good at exams. And so I think we have to find ways which are acceptable to all sorts of personalities and talents and abilities. Perhaps it's through interview. I mean, I remember doing my Part 3 exam. The best bit was actually the interview, and that was when you could convey serious knowledge or an aptitude or an understanding of the complexities of which you had studied for. And I think we have to be careful that we don't just introduce a whole nother bunch of exams and qualifications that we all have to achieve. I think it has to be accessible in the process, and that requires a certain kind of maturity of vision.
What's putting people off lifelong learning at the moment, and actually any form of CPD, is it's taking longer to fill out the spreadsheets to tell what you're doing than it is to actually do the CPD in the first place. And I think most of the lifelong learning courses that I've done recently are, I wouldn't say fun, but they're entertaining as well as informative and educational. And we need to make it seamless so that you do your hours, you know, whatever it is, sustainability or and then it automatically fills your logbook in, and you know you need to make it easy for people to do, and so you can do it on the train, you can do it on your phone, and if they're multiple choice, you go back and do it again. And I personally find that a really good way of learning, because you have to remember what you said the last time and if you've got it wrong or not. So I think that we're so backward. And when I go to Singapore or China or Malaysia, their thirst for knowledge, we're going to get left behind if we don't continually improve, because those guys are making us look backward, I think.
Maybe the RIBA needs to come up with an app you can put on your phone.
Yeah, well, so they are doing a lot of work on the RIBA Academy, but it's for too long it's been product based, and it's not really fit for purpose. And I think we need to demonstrate our competence. And the idea of having specialisms is that you can then convince politicians and decision makers that we have got particular skills, because they don't think of architects much at all. They think of it, we design or make houses look a bit nicer probably than or make buildings look nicer, but they don't really think of, they don't know that we have some of the best hospital designers, school designers, people that have spent their lifetime doing that kind of work, it's diminishing our influence with people that make those decisions and planning policy. So I think it's not the answer, but the reason I'm passionate about it is that it answers quite a lot of questions in order to, the things that I know architects are interested in is better pay, more influence. So I think they're the two key things that it tackles as well.
Eleanor, do you want to say anything on this?
Just briefly, I think the danger, I agree with the extra exams. I don't have time for any more checkboxes myself, but establishing valued knowledge, it's more the application of the knowledge or the coordination, and that's quite tricky to sort of demonstrate, I think. The collaborative aspect is hard to, you can't establish necessarily the value you add because it's going to be different on every project. But I think in terms of architectural services overall in the economy, perhaps we ought to sort of shout a bit louder about quite how much of an export industry it is, quite how much impact it has on the UK's balance of payments. Those sorts of things will probably help us more than sort of trying to safeguard a very small corner of something that sort of is fairly open source anyway. I don't know.
And Austin Williams, I actually teach Part 3 in Kingston. We don't do exams, we do coursework. But I do think that recently I've become interested in deregulating not just the title but also the function. And when you look at Denmark, it seems to be working reasonably well. They don't regulate either. Obviously, they have a very difficult language to manage if you ever want to get into their market. But not everybody's clamouring to become an architect in Denmark, I find. But there's something intriguing about, as Eleanor was saying, there's a defensiveness, protectionism going on within this conversation, which I find a little bit unhealthy. And I think maybe we should be a little bit more, I don't know, proud of ourselves, or a little bit more confident in the fact that we have something to offer just by doing the education. But that then comes back to something which I think all of you have said, which is that education is lacking in many ways in this conversation. So one of the responses that you gave, Chris, was about how it seemed to me that you were saying how AI could possibly fill in our ARB spreadsheets at the end of the year, which is a compelling vision, but obviously defeats the entire point of the bloody exercise. But I do think that actually having an education which teaches you maybe two things. One is to become a critical thinking human individual, which doesn't happen in universities anymore. And secondly, it does give you some inroads into understanding how architecture works from day one. What's happening at the moment is most students are working in practices for 4 days a week, coming to university for 1 day a week, and complaining that they've got too much work on, design work on. So I think that the whole thing is more of a root and branch. What we're tackling here is the end point, and I think we need to start a little bit further back.
There's no doubt. So I've been to lots of schools of architecture. The level of energy and enthusiasm of young people to be an architect is as great as it was when I was studying, and that's despite the student debt, the fact that a lot of them are working in a gig economy or holding down a job as well as trying to keep their student debt down. But I think. And that does have an impact on the teaching. If people are not having to do another job, whether it's as an apprentice or as a full-time student, but they're only, it's not really a full-time course anymore. It's a part-time, regardless of how you're training. But I think we do need to look at the way that architecture is taught, and this trying to reduce the amount of time, to reduce the student debt, and to avoid repetition, and to be able to have more diversity in the profession. We do need to look at how we can teach differently, so last week I was at Nottingham, and the week before at Hertford. On Friday I'm at Cambridge. Every course is different, but I do find that element of critical thinking. There's still a huge disparity between the top 10%, the bottom 10%, and the 8% in the middle. And the 8% is where we've got to raise the standard. But there's no. There is still that level of optimism of going into a profession, regardless of it being badly paid, which is quite laudable. But that's what I'm trying to do something about. I think we need to look at. I think Arb are quite right at looking at not getting fixated on the part 1, part 2, part 3. And when you hit your part 3, you're an architect. You're not an architect till probably 10 or 15 years after that. But I think it should be a continuum of lifelong learning to get you to where you want to be.
Hi, I'm Jalal. I work at a practice called FACTIN in West London. We do infrastructure, basically. I would like to add a caveat to the argument that education needs to do more. I think institutions need to be slightly more discerning in selecting cohorts as well. I've seen through my time, through BA and then Masters and now doing Part 3, we effectively let the industry filter out people by temperament rather than recognising the peculiar combination of patience and curiosity that is required to actually commit to having even a career of any time span in architecture. And I think sometimes I've seen institutions fall more on the side of filling courses for certain like for requirements of funding or whatever, fees and stuff. Yeah, I just think it's also about, you know, recognising how weird it is to try and be an architect, and making sure we give the right people that chance, because very high dropout rates are kind of a symptom of that lack of discernment, I feel like.
So do you think the schools are trying to fill places at the moment?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Stephanie. I am an architectural assistant at Child Grad & Lewis, and I previously worked at Chris Dyson Architects. I'm speaking from the perspective of being a recent immigrant from Hong Kong, and someone who was educated at Cornell in the US. So speaking from different qualification systems and transferring that process. So I wanted to point out that in the US, the system is extreme. It's a system with 6 exams, and it's all multiple choice, and some of them are upwards of 6 to 7 hours long. So it is actually very refreshing to go through the Part 3 process and to go through interviews and have some humanity in demonstrating your knowledge of the architectural profession. But what I wanted to say was, having worked in New York and seeing the sort of breadth of the architectural profession being just expanded, I think I want to comment on flight risk for highly ambitious people within architecture that want to flee to sort of higher earning positions that are in adjacent fields, such as project management, design strategy, consulting, and construction management. And I think it all just speaks to this global issue of low pay in the industry, and I just wonder if specialization and having to test your knowledge of that specialization will really help that issue, when a lot of it stems to just being poorly paid and wanting to survive and pay for more in a very expensive world.
I think it's a real risk, and I'm in my mid-30s, sort of 10 years post Part 3-ish, and I've seen a fair chunk of that, especially interestingly from female colleagues who've returned from having babies, who've had a year to think and a year outside of things, and have come back and gone, no, but not anymore, and have gone into client-side and contractor-side roles. So definitely, I would say.
So what do we do about it? That's the question.
Well, I think construction management and being a manager in the construction process, I know quite a few young architects that are doing that, because they can see that there's more of a starting salary as going to work for somebody like Mace. Other managers are available, and that is a specialism. And I think if you've got that, you know, we're our own worst enemy in lots of ways. That all of our awards are for the designer, rather the guy who does the sketch on the napkin, rather than the firm that actually got that napkin built. And I think so. I think there's lots of things we need to look at and embrace the whole of the profession, rather than just laud one aspect of it. Because and allow and acknowledge that recognition, and I think, you know, that goes throughout the whole of the process. So I don't have an issue with having those construction managers as part of the RIBA, because I think it's an important role, and those young architects that I know that have gone on to be client advisor on the client side or with housing developers, they'll probably have more influence on architecture than they would have done as an architect. So then they ought to be architects.
Robin Nicholson, I'm a fellow of Cullinan Studio and convener of a think tank called The Edge. Lots of really good things have been said this evening, which is great, and I'm glad we're all here. Underpinning a lot of the sort of anxiety is, and I'll probably be shouted down for saying this, there are just far too many architects. I mean, when I was at school, you know, there were 20 in the year, and there are now 120 in the first year, and there were 20 schools, and there are now 50 schools. I mean, that's probably got
78.
60.
70, I thought it was
78
68.
schools.
And you think, what on earth for? And you know, it's not cheap to train architects, so why do the universities want them? So it was very sexy at some stage, and then it became a liability. So it seems to me as though collectively we have a response, and we all enjoy the lateral thinking that architects have and the skills that many of us like to think we have. But it seems to me that beyond part one, it's a responsibility of any school at the moment to train people in other disciplines, complementary disciplines. So we haven't got enough building services engineers. I know lots of people, architects who are now acting as heads of sustainability in other organisations, very good use, but they should be doing the work itself. There's a desperate shortage of landscape architects, very closely related discipline, but it seems to me as though we've got to open the door rather than have and deal with this fact of people fleeing.
Look at history. In recent history, polytechnics were a great environment in that regard to propagate people who wanted to choose a module almost. You could go from architecture into town planning or into construction or surveying or all these different things. And it was seen as perfectly acceptable. I think as we've kind of tried to make everything for everyone, in having a degree for everyone, for everything, we as a nation, we have at the same time lost sight of how sensible certain things were. And I'm not saying it was good in the old days, I'm just saying there are some examples there to learn from, and that perhaps we should just relearn those things. And one thing I think we haven't really touched on is the idea of apprenticeship. I think is a really good economic model for this country. For Christ's sake, if we can't afford to pay people well enough and they want to go to university, that's a really good system. And why have we should be, as the RIBA and the ARB, we should be lobbying hard for the level 7 to continue. It's ridiculous. This is the current government is supposed to be somebody who's interested in social progression through any career. And it just seems to me that is a golden opportunity to actually help young people find a foot in life and generate more income for themselves.
I'm Ben Darbyshire. I'm chair of HTA Design. So I also like an awful lot of what's been said. And I applaud Chris, and all strength to your elbow, Chris, in trying to stimulate this discussion and get somewhere with it. And I agree with you, and I try to do much of what it is you're attempting. And I see, and my own practice is a specialist practice, with a lot of subspecialisms within our specialism of housing. So I absolutely see the positive benefits of that in competitive terms. The key thing, of course, is to deliver value, and value that's perceived by clients and society as worth paying for, in particular paying more for. My worry is, and I'm really interested to know from the panel how we get around this, the dead hand of bureaucracy, your point, the exam point. And in our practice, we do a lot of research and we try to be ahead of the game, and it's highly competitive. I shudder at the thought of somebody at ARB constructing a multiple choice question that's going to test competence in some of the things that we're trying to break ground with, So I really think, I like Austin's point and Ellie's point too. We have to enable a really open source approach to this. A bit like, being a business manager on the continent where you do endless and quite disparate examinations and prove your worth, with brands from different universities. We mustn't, I think, make it some blanket bureaucratic approach which would kill us all off.
There used to be, lots of people do online modules. Architecture Today do them. There's lots of web-based assessment, and most of them are interesting and fun to do. And you should be able to make it much more exciting to do and get people stimulated about, every subject can be made interesting. And I think we're not using technology at the moment to get people excited about doing lifelong learning. And you know, like the modular housing that you do, and lots of people would like to know how it's done, but it's done in such a dry way at the moment in terms of the modules that you have to do, or to demonstrate your knowledge. But I think architects are endlessly curious, and we just need to be able to stimulate, let people curate their own careers to do, and be able to switch between their specialisms as they get older and move into whatever they want to move into, whether it's management or sustainability or finance or whatever. But I think that we're not utilising the technology that allows people to learn. I think that technology seems to be making us more stupid at the moment than it is clever.
Any?
I think competency on specialisms, I think you're right, because I'm sure lots of people here are also struggling with some of the way the Building Safety Act has been drafted and some of the sort of difficulty with actually doing that on a project. We've got a refurb project that's a high-risk building, and I don't think the building safety regulator was ready for that. But perhaps competency needs to be a bit broader rather than competency of specialisms. But I think protection of function of the process is probably worth doing. Even if it is the dead hand of bureaucracy, it's sort of a blunt tool and a broader one is probably more worthwhile than letting anyone have a go on some of these things, like building regulations applications, for instance, perhaps.
My name is Greg Froggatt. I work for Fackling Architects in West London. We specialise in infrastructure architecture. I think I wanted to take a sort of more holistic view in terms of what is a profession, what is the professional function within the profession, and if we approach it from a sort of the society at large, and from a consumer perspective, the profession is deemed to be something that is a skill set that one can purchase in order to improve your going about your business, whether it be legal or whether it be medicine. I suppose the notion is here how, and this goes on to explore specialisms. The commodity of profession is based on respect and the consistent ability to deliver services that might be specialist. And I think this sort of consistent applied sort of standards and knowledge is very important for maintaining and improving the public's perception, for lack of a better phrase, of architecture with a little a and architects with a little a in this instance. You wouldn't ask sort of the level of corporate tax advice from your local parish office accountant, in terms of where you seek your special knowledge. I suppose the term architect traditionally, and going back to Christopher Wren, has been this notion of management. It's managing a lot of other, a huge team essentially, and accepting that you're not a specialist in that instant. I suppose the question I'm asking is are we looking at the wrong end of the question in regards to what is the profession and how we sell it essentially within the commercial world we live? And I think that the idea of specialism and the broader brush of that will be a step towards that.
In my career, architecture has become less of a profession and more of a job. And I mean that. So when Dennis Lasdon designed the National Theatre, he was the principal designer. He knew that building inside out. He knew he was going to be doing it from beginning to end. He made all the design decisions. He integrated the services and the structure with a brilliant bit of architecture. That's not, the profession is not like that anymore. we get commissioned to do part of a project, and then somebody else might get commissioned to do another bit, and there's so much lost knowledge. So I think, and also he got a 6% fee for that. Now that fee is probably 2% or 1%. I mean you can understand why Thatcher wanted to do what she did and deregulate the profession. But that deregulation and allowing that amount of competition has done us irreparable harm. And I think now that has Dame Judith Hackett said that's the principal reason, one of the principal reasons for the Grenfell Tower was that procurement system. Everything is based on the lowest price, and that's what you get. You get people that don't know what they're doing. And that's what we've got to try and address.
Yeah. Simon Fraser, principal at Hopkins Architects. Chris, I think all you're saying is, and everyone here is completely right, but I think you've got to be careful not to lower or damage the status of the architect, because I think your message is not that clear. I think everything you're saying about specialisation is completely right, but it comes across when you say, I'm no longer an architect, it's a bit odd to people. People think, well, hang on, what's going on here? Why is he no longer an architect? And why? And then the message I think you should be pushing is that we're incredibly skilled and we have lots of specialists, which is exactly what you've just been saying. But it does get very confusing when you're abroad. In America, doing a building in America or Japan or Middle East or something like this, the British, as a British architect, you're really respected. And I think we're in danger of talking, washing our dirty laundry in front of people and lowering our status. And I think you should be reinforcing how amazing architects are. They're really amazing. And that story you're saying about these students turning up at their IBA and you saying, well, actually anyone can be an architect or something like this. I think it's just the other way around. You should be grateful that this is a fantastic profession to be in, and you should be reinforcing that. I'm sure you are, but the message is not coming across.
I mean,
it's odd to say.
It is. I mean, British architects are more revered abroad than they are at home. Stating the facts and trying to do something about it. So you have to set out the problem first, and then say this is what we think the solution is. But I agree with you that we have some of the best architects in the world. But that message isn't getting across.
I agree.
And that's what we need to do, and we need to raise the standard of the ones that aren't as good.
Yeah, I think though somehow before you finish your tenure, you should try and reinforce that.
Yeah.
Go about turn and say,
Reapply.
Sorry?
So my name is Will Friedman. I'm an architect. I'm on the board of the ARB. And have been for 7 years. I think that point that was just raised is actually one I find interesting as an architect, and not as a board member necessarily, is I'm struggling with the way that you particularly, Chris, has articulated your points this evening, is I get the sense you're trying to boil the ocean and not focusing on a narrow part of some of the points of view you've got. I suppose the other thing I'm going to say is that when you were pitching to be the president, I think I was at that session as well at the RIBA, and I asked what you were going to do to work with the RIBA, with the ARB, and you said you would. And this doesn't feel like you're working with the ARB. I'm just curious to see how you, a bit like the gentleman from Hopkins has just said, how you're going to turn that round. I've also heard of a lot of architects who are not, there's a small group here, but a lot of architects that don't support your action, maybe The gentleman Hopkins is one of those, I don't know. But so I'm just curious to know how you might do less of boiling the ocean, slightly more focused. You've got some good ideas that you're trying to deal with. I wonder if they should just become slightly more focused.
Yeah, I'm not a confrontational person. I've done everything in my career collaboratively, and when I, to be totally honest, it wasn't my intention to be confrontational with ARB. I would like to work with ARB and formulate the solution together, and I think that's what we need to do. I think there's a role for ARB to regulate not just architecture, but the other professions as well, and that's what the government wants us to do. And I think that it will go down incredibly badly if we bicker, and we won't get anywhere. Nobody's at all interested. The government's not at all interested in us squabbling and saying, you know, we need to do this collaboratively, not just within architecture, but with the other professions as well. Otherwise, we won't get anywhere. But I'm conscious that this has been talked about for 20 years and it wasn't going anywhere. So I think, you know, raising it as an issue has certainly got people's attention. But as I said, you know, now's the time to, and I get on really well with Alan Kershaw and Hugh, and I have a lot of respect for them, and I can see a way forward to actually getting to where we want to get to.
Great. Well, sorry, did you want to jump in?
I was just thinking, perhaps one of the ways of less of internalising of this discussion is to actually perhaps invite a forum of clients to
You just stole my thunder.
tease this. I'm sorry. Tease out, you know, what it is that clients like about employing good architects. What do they see as the values? They're our customers, for God's sake. We could have a forum like this where we invite different sectors of clients to talk and see and describe their experience of working with an architectural team. We don't get that enough. We don't get that feedback enough as architects. I really don't think we do. We give an award for the best client of the year, but it doesn't say much other than, yes, this was voted a nice client, but we don't get any feedback, and I think that would be something, a forum worth having to help.
Well, I'm going to stop you there before you do the whole of my summary. No, that's great. Thanks, everyone. I think it probably is time to close. There were two things I thought that I picked up from this. I think our training, and we always want to be generalist, and I mean that's what our training is all about, and I think there's a value to that. I mean, we've talked about this, but we've also said that we need to be specialists as well. So there's a term that I coined a few years ago that hasn't really been picked up yet, so if you could promote it, that would be good. It's that we are a jack of all trades, but master of one, and I think this is what we need to try and do. So that was one thing, and the other thing was what Chris has just said. So I was going to say, you know, I said at the beginning that this is a big topic and it's a very topical issue, and we want to, I think there are opportunities for us as a profession to talk about this. And I'd be interested to hear, you know, if anyone has other ideas for sort of events that we could hold here. And I was going to say that my slight concern is that we can be a little bit introspective and that we should be talking to our clients. We've got at least one client in the room here, and I was wondering what he was thinking while we were saying this. And so, yeah, I do think we should be going and asking our clients, you know, what is it that they want from us? And perhaps the answer lies in that. So, yeah, if anyone does have any ideas for events. So I think we're going to close it there. So thanks, everyone, for your contributions. It's been super interesting. Thanks very much to our president of the RIBA for really getting things going by stopping calling himself an architect, or stopping being able to anyway. Yeah, so thanks very much, everyone. And thanks, everyone. Perhaps you could all help me in applauding our speakers.